April 29, 1945, noon, the iron gates of Ravensbrück concentration camp swung open under a gray northern sky, dragged apart by the hands of American soldiers who had never seen anything like what lay beyond. The smell arrived first, a thickness in the air that clung to the throat, a mixture of ash, human waste, and something older, something that had been rotting for years. The women stood in clusters near the barracks, skeletal figures in striped rags, their eyes hollowed by starvation and disbelief. Some did not move at all. They simply watched, as if movement itself required a kind of hope they had long since abandoned. The wind carried the distant sound of artillery, but here, inside the wire, there was only silence. The silence of those who had learned that speaking too loudly could mean death. The American medics moved among them carefully, speaking in low voices, offering water, blankets, chocolate bars wrapped in waxed paper. The women flinched at kindness. They had been trained by cruelty to expect cruelty, and tenderness felt like a trap. One soldier, a young corporal from Pennsylvania, knelt beside an elderly Polish woman whose hands trembled as she reached for a canteen. She drank, then wept, then drank again, the water spilling down her chin. He did not understand her language, but he understood her tears. He had a sister back home who kept a diary, a little leather-bound book she wrote in every night. He thought of that diary now, of the safety it represented, of the luxury of private thoughts. He could not have known in that moment that within days the American command would issue an order that would shake the foundations of everything these women understood about captivity, about power, about what it meant to be human again. They would be allowed to keep diaries. To understand the weight of this moment, one must first understand what had been taken. Ravensbrück was not merely a prison. It was a machine designed to erase identity, to strip away the self until nothing remained but a number tattooed on an arm and a body that could labor until it collapsed. Established in 1939, 50 miles north of Berlin, it was the largest concentration camp for women in the Nazi Reich. A sprawling complex of barracks, factories, and execution grounds where over 130,000 women from across occupied Europe were imprisoned. They were political dissidents, resistance fighters, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, Jews, lesbians, so-called asocials, anyone the regime deemed unworthy of existence. The camp's motto, inscribed in iron above the gates, was a lie wrapped in propaganda: Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. But work here meant slow death, 12-hour shifts in munitions factories, road construction crews, textile workshops where women sewed SS uniforms with fingers that bled through the fabric. Food rations were calculated to sustain life just long enough to extract labor, then allow death. 200 grams of bread per day. Watery soup made from potato peels. On Sundays, if the guards were feeling generous, a sliver of margarine. But it was not starvation alone that broke the spirit. It was the systematic destruction of privacy, of thought, of the inner life. Letters were forbidden. Personal possessions were confiscated. Names were replaced with numbers. The guards conducted random searches of barracks, tearing apart straw mattresses, confiscating anything that suggested individuality. A scrap of fabric, a pebble shaped like a heart, a pencil stub hidden in a seam. Women who were caught with writing materials were beaten, sometimes killed. The act of recording one's own thoughts was considered sabotage, a form of resistance, because it implied that one's inner life mattered, that one's story deserved to be told. The Nazis understood, perhaps better than anyone, that memory was dangerous. If the prisoners could remember who they had been before the wire, if they could document what was being done to them, then the Reich's greatest weapon, erasure, would fail. And so the women learned to remember in secret. They memorized poems, recited them silently during roll call, passing verses from one prisoner to another like contraband. They made mental lists of the dead, repeating names in their heads so that someone, someday, might bear witness. A French resistance fighter named Geneviève de Gaulle, niece of Charles de Gaulle, later wrote that the mind became a fortress, the only place the guards could not enter. She memorized entire chapters of books she had read before the war, replaying them in her thoughts during the endless hours of forced labor. The Polish political prisoner Wanda Podczaszka, a medical student, mentally composed letters to her mother, letters she knew she would never be allowed to send. These acts of interior defiance were all that remained of autonomy, and even they were fragile, subject to the erasure of exhaustion, disease, despair. By the spring of 1945, Ravensbrück was collapsing under its own atrocities. The gas chambers had been working overtime as the Nazis accelerated their extermination programs, desperate to eliminate evidence before the Allied armies arrived. The SS began evacuating prisoners on death marches, forcing thousands of women to walk westward through the freezing countryside, shooting anyone who stumbled. Those too weak to walk were left behind, locked in barracks with no food, no water, waiting to die. The Swedish Red Cross managed to negotiate the release of some Scandinavian prisoners, but the majority remained trapped, caught between the advancing Soviet forces from the east and the retreating SS guards who had orders to leave no witnesses. It was into this hell that the Americans arrived, not as liberators in the traditional sense. Ravensbrück was technically liberated by Soviet forces on April 30, 1945, but as part of the broader Allied effort to secure and stabilize the camps. American medical units, intelligence officers, and relief workers flooded into the region in the days and weeks following liberation, tasked with the impossible, saving lives, documenting crimes, and beginning the long process of helping survivors return to a world that no longer existed. They brought supplies, medicines, personnel. They also brought something else, something the women had not expected: the assumption that they were still people with rights, with voices, with stories worth preserving. The order came quietly, almost as an afterthought. An American relief coordinator, a woman named Lieutenant Helen Morrison from the Army Nurse Corps, was distributing supplies in one of the barracks when a Polish prisoner approached her, speaking in broken English. The prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Zofia, asked if she could have paper. Not for a letter, she clarified. For writing. Lieutenant Morrison, not fully understanding, assumed she meant medical notes or administrative records. She handed over a small notebook and a pencil. Zofia held the objects in her hands as if they were made of glass, her fingers trembling. She opened the notebook, stared at the blank page, and began to cry. Other women saw this. They approached Lieutenant Morrison with the same request: paper, pencils, permission to write. The lieutenant, moved and confused, consulted with her superiors. The initial response was bureaucratic. Writing materials were in short supply, needed for official documentation. But Morrison persisted. She had seen the way the women looked at the notebooks, the reverence, the hunger. This was not about logistics. This was about something deeper. She argued that allowing the survivors to write would serve a dual purpose. It would aid psychological recovery and create first-hand historical records of what had occurred in the camps. Her commanding officer, a pragmatic man who had witnessed the horrors of Buchenwald and Dachau, agreed. An order was issued. Prisoners could keep personal diaries. They would be provided with notebooks, pencils, even pens when available. The diaries would be theirs, private, not subject to confiscation or censorship. The announcement was made in multiple languages, translated by prisoners who spoke German, French, Polish, Russian. For many, the words did not register at first. A diary? Personal writing? It seemed too absurd, too dangerous. Surely this was a trick, a new form of psychological torture. The SS had employed such tactics before, offering false hope, then snatching it away to maximize despair. But the Americans did not snatch. They distributed the notebooks, small composition books with cardboard covers, the kind schoolchildren used. They placed them in the hands of women who had not been allowed to hold a pen in years, and then they left the women alone. The first entries were tentative, almost fearful. Women wrote their names as if testing whether the act would be punished. My name is Yvette Farnoux. I was born in Lyon. I am alive. Simple statements of existence. But even these felt revolutionary. Under the Nazis, names had been erased, replaced with numbers. To write one's own name was to reclaim identity. Some women wrote in their native languages: French, Polish, Czech, Dutch, Russian. Others, who had been forced to speak only German in the camp, struggled to remember the words of their mother tongues. The act of writing itself was physically difficult. Hands ravaged by frostbite, malnutrition, and forced labor could barely grip the pencils. Fingers bent at unnatural angles from untreated fractures. Eyes weakened by starvation struggled to focus on the page, yet they wrote. The content varied. Some women recorded factual details, dates, names of the dead, descriptions of the guards who had tortured them. These entries were forensic, intended as evidence. A French resistance member named Marie-Claude Vaillant-Fauchurier, who would later testify at the Nuremberg trials, used her diary to document the medical experiments performed on prisoners, the forced sterilizations, the children torn from their mothers. Her handwriting was shaky but precise, each word deliberate. She understood that her diary might be the only proof that these atrocities had occurred. Other women wrote more introspectively, grappling with the psychological devastation of their experiences. A German political prisoner, a communist named Margarete Buber-Neumann, wrote about the cognitive dissonance of returning to a world where people still argued about politics, still cared about petty grievances, while she had watched women burned alive. "How do I explain," she wrote, "that the smell of roasting meat makes me vomit? How do I tell them that I know what burning human flesh smells like?" Still others wrote about the small mercies, the unexpected beauty. A Dutch woman named Corrie ten Boom, a devout Christian imprisoned for hiding Jews, filled her diary with observations of sunlight filtering through the barracks cracks, the way a fellow prisoner had shared a crust of bread, the hymns they had sung in whispers. Her entries were suffused with a fragile gratitude, a determination to find grace even in horror. "Today," she wrote, "an American soldier gave me chocolate. I ate half and saved half for the woman who sleeps beside me. Her name is Anna. I do not know if she will live until morning, but tonight she tasted sweetness." The act of writing transformed the barracks. Women who had not spoken in months found their voices through the page. They read entries aloud to one another, creating impromptu literary gatherings where stories were shared, validated, mourned. The diaries became communal property in a sense, not physically. For each woman guarded hers fiercely but emotionally. One woman's entry about losing her daughter might prompt another to write about her own lost child, creating a tapestry of collective grief. The notebooks were passed around carefully, so that illiterate prisoners could have their words transcribed by those who could write. A Roma woman who had never learned to read dictated her story to a Polish teacher, who wrote it down in careful script, preserving the rhythm and cadence of oral tradition. The Americans watched this unfold with a mixture of awe and discomfort. They had expected gratitude, relief, perhaps even joy, and those emotions were present, but the diaries revealed something more complicated: the magnitude of what had been lost, the impossibility of return. Lieutenant Morrison read excerpts that prisoners voluntarily shared, and she was shaken by the realization that liberation was not an ending, but a beginning of a different kind of suffering. "They are free," she wrote in her own journal, "but freedom has nowhere to take them. Their families are dead. Their homes are destroyed. Their countries have been carved up by war, and yet they write. They write as if their lives depend on it. Perhaps they do." What the women had expected in those first days after the gates opened was survival, nothing more, nothing less. They had expected food, medicine, perhaps transport to displaced persons' camps where they would wait for the bureaucratic machinery of post-war Europe to decide their fates. They had expected to be processed, categorized, moved along. They had not expected to be treated as individuals with inner lives worth preserving. They had certainly not expected that the soldiers who freed them would care about their thoughts, their memories, their stories. The German guards had trained them to believe that their subjectivity was worthless, that their pain was irrelevant. The Nazis had constructed an entire ideology around the notion that certain lives were unworthy of life. Leben unwertes Leben. And even now, with the guards gone, the barbed wire cut, the ovens cold, that ideology lingered in the women's minds like a poison. They had internalized their own worthlessness. They had learned to see themselves through the eyes of their captors. The permission to keep diaries dismantled that internalization slowly and painfully. It was a declaration, implicit but unmistakable. Your thoughts matter. Your memories matter. You matter. This was not a message the women were prepared to receive. A Czech Jewish prisoner named Hanna Pravda later wrote about the cognitive shock of that first week. "I had lived for 3 years believing that I was less than human," she recalled. "I had been told this every day by the guards, by the work, by the starvation. And I had begun to believe it. When the Americans handed me a notebook and said I could write whatever I wanted, I did not know what to do. What does a non-person write about? What story does an animal tell?" She stared at the blank page for 2 days before writing a single word. Why? That question, why, echoed through the diaries. Why had this happened? Why had ordinary people become murderers? Why had the world allowed it? Why had God been silent? The women grappled with these questions not philosophically, but viscerally, through the specifics of their experiences. They wrote about the moment they were arrested, the transport trains, the selection process, the first night in the barracks. They wrote about the guards, trying to understand how a woman, for many of the guards at Ravensbrück were women, could beat another woman to death over a stolen potato. They wrote about the collaborators, the prisoner functionaries who would enforce the rules with even more brutality than the SS, hoping to save themselves. They wrote about the moments of resistance, small and large, the prisoner who smuggled medicine, the woman who taught French lessons in secret, the group that sabotaged munitions in the factory. But the diaries also confronted a more uncomfortable truth: the complicity of silence. Many of the women were not Jews. They were political prisoners, resistance fighters, women arrested for refusing to comply with Nazi laws. They had been imprisoned for their defiance, and they wore that defiance as a badge of honor. Yet the diaries reveal the moral complexity of survival. To survive, one had to make choices. One had to accept the Red Cross packages that were denied to Jewish prisoners. One had to work in factories that produced weapons for the Wehrmacht. One had to walk past the sick barracks where typhus raged, past the infirmary where Dr. Herta Oberheiser conducted her sadistic experiments, and say nothing, do nothing, because to intervene was to D. The diaries became confessionals. Women wrote about the guilt that gnawed at them, the sense that survival itself was a form of betrayal. A French prisoner named Germaine Tillion, an ethnologist who would later become a prominent scholar, wrote extensively about this moral quagmire. "I am alive," she noted, "and that means I made choices. I chose to live when others died. I chose silence when speech was needed. I chose myself. And now I must live with that." The American soldiers, for their part, had expected to encounter victims, broken women who needed saving, who would weep with gratitude and then fade into the background of history. What they encountered instead were survivors, a subtle but critical distinction. Victims are passive, defined by what was done to them. Survivors are active, defined by what they endured and overcame. The women of Ravensbrück were not interested in being saved. They were interested in bearing witness. They wanted their stories recorded, not out of vanity or victimhood, but out of a fierce determination that the world would not be allowed to forget, that the perpetrators would not escape into the anonymity of post-war chaos. The diaries were weapons in this fight. Every entry was an act of defiance against erasure, against the Nazi project of genocide, which sought not only to kill bodies, but to obliterate memory. Lieutenant Morrison came to understand this as she spent more time in the camp. She had initially viewed the diary project as a form of therapy, a way to help traumatized women process their experiences. But as she read the entries that women shared with her, she realized that the diaries were not therapeutic in the conventional sense. They were not about healing. They were about documentation, about justice, about ensuring that the dead were not forgotten. One prisoner, a Belgian woman named Suzanne, showed Morrison her diary, which was less a personal journal than a meticulously compiled list of names. Every woman who had died in Suzanne's barracks was recorded, along with the date and, when known, the cause of death. Shot, gassed, beaten, starved, hanged, worked to death, died of typhus, died of despair. The list went on for pages. Suzanne's handwriting was tiny, cramped, as if she were trying to fit the entire camp into the notebook. "I write their names," she told Morrison, "so that someone will know they existed, so that their families, if any survive, can know what happened, so that the world cannot pretend this did not occur." This insistence on documentation was shared by many of the prisoners. They saw themselves not merely as survivors but as witnesses, and the diaries were their testimony. The Americans, recognizing the historical value of these records, began to encourage the project more actively. Military historians and intelligence officers visited the camp, interviewing prisoners, collecting diaries, photographing entries. Some women were reluctant to hand over their notebooks, fearing confiscation. But when they were assured that the diaries would be copied and returned, many agreed. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum would later acquire several of these diaries, preserving them as primary sources. The entries are haunting in their specificity, their refusal to generalize or abstract. They name names, they describe acts, they assign responsibility, and they do so in the plain, unadorned language of truth. The symbolic weight of the diary of paper and pencil cannot be overstated. In a camp where everything had been stripped away, clothing, food, dignity, life, the simple act of writing became an assertion of humanity. The pencil, blunt and small, was a tool of creation in a place built for destruction. The paper, fragile and easily torn, was a vessel for permanence in a place designed for erasure. And the diary itself, that private space between covers, was a declaration of interiority, of the self that endures even when the body is broken. This symbolism was not lost on the women. Many of them wrote explicitly about the meaning of the diary, the almost sacred quality it had acquired. A Polish prisoner named Krystyna Julska, who had been a cabaret performer before the war, wrote about the first time she held a pencil in the camp. "I had forgotten the weight of it," she wrote. "The way it fits in the hand, the way the graphite leaves a mark. It is such a small thing, a pencil. But in this place, it is everything. It is proof that thought still exists, that words still matter, that I am still me." Julska used her diary to write poetry, short verses about the camp, about survival, about the absurdity of suffering. She performed these poems for other prisoners, reciting them from memory after she had filled the pages of her notebook. The poems became part of the camp's underground culture, passed from barracks to barracks, memorized and repeated. After the war, Julska published a memoir based on her diary entries titled "I Came Back," which became one of the earliest survivor testimonies from Ravensbrück. For others, the diary was a way to maintain connection with the past, with the world before the war. They wrote about their childhoods, their families, their homes. They described meals they had eaten, holidays they had celebrated, ordinary moments that had once seemed unremarkable but now glowed with the light of irretrievable loss. A Dutch woman named Edie Hillesum, whose diary from Westerbork transit camp had become a spiritual classic, had written before her deportation to Auschwitz that one must keep a piece of one's soul unsullied. The women of Ravensbrück understood this instinctively. The diary was that piece of the soul, the part the Nazis could not reach, could not defile, even as their bodies wasted away, even as they watched friends die. The act of writing preserved something essential, something irreducible. The Americans, observing this, began to see the diary project not merely as a humanitarian gesture, but as a profound challenge to totalitarianism. The Nazi regime had sought to control not only actions but thoughts, to create a society where private consciousness itself was subordinated to the will of the state. The camps were the ultimate expression of this ambition, places where individuality was systematically destroyed, where the self was dissolved into the mass, the number, the anonymous dead. By allowing the prisoners to keep diaries, the Americans were asserting a different vision, that the individual conscience is sovereign, that the inner life cannot and must not be subjugated, that freedom begins in the mind. This was a deeply American idea, rooted in the Enlightenment principles of personal liberty and the sanctity of individual thought. It was also, in the context of Ravensbrück, a radical act of defiance against everything the camp represented. Some of the soldiers understood this intuitively. A young officer from New York, a literature major before the war, spent hours talking with the prisoners about their diaries. He brought them extra notebooks, scrounged pencils from supply depots, even provided a few precious pens with real ink. He read excerpts they shared, and he was struck by the literary quality of the writing, the vivid descriptions, the moral complexity. "These women are not just recording history," he wrote to his wife. "They are creating it. They are writing the story of what happened here, and their words will outlive us all." TAP's allied failures, with the limits of moral action in wartime, with the question of what responsibility the liberators bore for the horrors they had not prevented. As the weeks passed, the diaries began to change in tone. The initial entries, raw and factual, gave way to more reflective writing. The women started to think beyond survival, beyond documentation. They began to ask what came next. Where would they go? How would they live? What did freedom even mean when everyone you loved was dead? When your country no longer existed? When the language you spoke had become the language of your oppressors? The diaries became spaces to explore these questions, to articulate the dislocation and disorientation of liberation. A recurring theme was the impossibility of return. Many of the prisoners had been arrested years earlier, and the world they remembered had vanished. Cities had been bombed into rubble. Borders had been redrawn. Entire communities had been exterminated. A Polish Jewish woman wrote about learning that her hometown no longer had a single Jewish resident. The synagogue had been burned, the Jewish cemetery had been desecrated. The houses where Jews had lived were now occupied by Poles who claimed they had always been there. "There is no going back," she wrote. "The past is a country that no longer exists, and so I am a citizen of nowhere, belonging to no place, wanted by no one." This sense of statelessness, of existential homelessness, permeated many of the diaries. The women were physically free, but psychologically adrift, suspended between a past that was dead and a future that was unimaginable. The Americans tried to help. Their efforts were often clumsy, shaped by cultural assumptions that did not translate. They spoke about rebuilding, about returning to normal life, about the opportunities that would come with peace, but the women knew there was no normal life to return to. Normal had been annihilated. One American chaplain, a well-meaning man from Iowa, tried to offer comfort by reading Bible verses about hope and redemption. A French prisoner, a former philosophy teacher, listened politely and then wrote in her diary, "He speaks of hope as if it is a thing one can choose, like a dress in a shop window, but hope is not a choice. It is a luxury. And we who have seen what we have seen are too poor to afford it." Yet paradoxically, the act of writing itself was a form of hope. By documenting their experiences, the women were asserting that their lives had meaning, that their suffering was not random or pointless, that the future might someday care about the past. They were writing for audiences they could not see, for readers who did not yet exist, for a world that might or might not be willing to listen. This required a kind of faith, a belief that words mattered, that truth had power, that bearing witness was itself a form of resistance. The diaries were thus both a record of despair and an act of optimism, a paradox that the women navigated daily. Some of the entries were addressed to specific people, mothers, husbands, children who were almost certainly dead but whose imagined presence provided a structure for the writing. A German political prisoner wrote long letters to her son in her diary, letters she knew he would never read. "My dearest boy," one entry began, "today I saw the sky without barbed wire. It is blue, so impossibly blue, and I thought of the day you were born, the day the midwife placed you in my arms, and you opened your eyes and looked at me as if you knew me already. I wonder if you would know me now. I wonder if I would know myself." These entries were heartbreaking in their tenderness, their refusal to relinquish love even in the face of absolute loss. Others wrote as if addressing posterity, future generations who would need to understand what had happened. These entries were often didactic, almost pedagogical, explaining the mechanics of the camp, the hierarchy of prisoners, the strategies for survival. A Czech teacher wrote a detailed account of how the camp economy functioned, how bread could be traded for soap, soap for information, information for protection. She described the brutal logic of scarcity, the way it turned prisoners against each other, the moral compromises it demanded. "I write this," she explained, "so that those who come after will understand that survival in such a place is not heroic, it is not noble. It is a series of small betrayals of oneself and others, and the fact that I survived means that I am complicit. I made those betrayals, and I will carry them for the rest of my life." The diaries also recorded the practical challenges of liberation. The camp was overcrowded, undersupplied, riddled with disease. Typhus was epidemic, spread by lice that infested the barracks. The Americans brought DDT, spraying prisoners and bedding, but the disease continued to kill even after liberation. Women who had survived years of starvation and brutality died in the weeks following freedom, their bodies too weakened to fight infection. The diaries documented these deaths with a grim attention to detail, noting names, dates, symptoms. One entry, written by a nurse who had been imprisoned for helping wounded resistance fighters, described the death of a young Russian woman. She survived the gas. She survived the beatings. She survived the death march. But she could not survive typhus. She died this morning 3 weeks after the Americans arrived. Her last words were in Russian, and I do not know what they meant. But I think she was asking for her mother. We are all asking for our mothers. The food provided by the Americans was another source of both relief and trauma. After years of starvation, the prisoners' bodies could not handle rich or abundant food. Chocolate, which the soldiers handed out generously, caused severe digestive distress. Women who ate too much too quickly became violently ill, and some died from refeeding syndrome, a condition where the body, accustomed to starvation, cannot process sudden nutrition. The diaries recorded these paradoxes, the bitter irony of being killed by kindness. Today, one woman wrote, "I ate an orange. I have not tasted an orange since before the war. It was sweet and tart and perfect. And then I vomited for an hour. My body no longer knows how to accept goodness." Yet there were also moments of joy, small but piercing. A Polish woman wrote about the first time she laughed after liberation. A spontaneous, uncontrollable laughter that felt like a kind of insanity. She and another prisoner had been discussing the absurdity of their situation, free but homeless, alive but bereaved, and suddenly they were laughing, tears streaming down their faces. "Unable to stop, we laughed," she wrote, "because the alternative was to scream. And we have screamed enough for a lifetime." These moments of unexpected lightness punctuated the diaries, reminders that even in the aftermath of atrocity, the human capacity for joy persists. Fragile and strange, but undeniable. The transformation that occurred in those first months after liberation was profound but incomplete. The women were no longer prisoners, but they were not yet free in any meaningful sense. They were suspended in a liminal state between the hell of the camp and the uncertain world beyond. The diaries tracked this transition, this slow and painful process of becoming human again. Some women wrote about the difficulty of making even simple decisions: what to wear, where to go, what to eat. After years of having every choice dictated by guards and camp routine, autonomy was overwhelming. A French woman wrote about standing in front of a table laden with bread, unable to choose which piece to take. "I stood there for 10 minutes, she wrote, "paralyzed by the abundance. In the camp, there was no choice. You took what you were given, or you starved. But here there were 6 loaves of bread, and I could take whichever I wanted, and I did not know how to want. I had forgotten how to desire." The Americans, witnessing this paralysis, began to implement programs designed to help the survivors reintegrate. They offered classes in vocational skills, language lessons, psychological counseling. Some prisoners participated eagerly, grateful for the structure. Others resisted, seeing these programs as another form of control, another attempt to dictate who they should be. The diaries reflected this ambivalence. One woman wrote appreciatively about an English class taught by a kind American volunteer. "Learning English," she noted, "is learning hope. It is learning that there might be a future, that I might go somewhere new, that I might speak a language that has no memory of this place." Another woman wrote scathingly about a counseling session where she was encouraged to let go of her anger. "The counselor told me I need to forgive," she wrote. "Forgive whom? The guards who beat me, the doctors who experimented on my body, the neighbors who turned us in, the world that did nothing." She speaks of forgiveness as if it is a medicine, a cure. "But I do not want to be cured of my anger. My anger is all I have left. It is proof that I still care, that I have not given up, that I refuse to pretend this was anything other than evil." The question of justice loomed large in the diaries. The women wanted the perpetrators held accountable, wanted trials, wanted executions. They followed news of the Nuremberg trials with intense interest, and many were called to testify. The diaries show the preparation for these testimonies, the rehearsal of facts, the struggle to find words adequate to the horror. A Polish prisoner who testified at Nuremberg wrote about the experience in her diary. "I stood in the courtroom," she wrote, "and I looked at the men in the dock, the SS officers who had ruled our lives with such absolute power. And they looked so small, so ordinary. Göring was fat and smug. Hess was vacant, staring at nothing. Ribbentrop was nervous, fidgeting with his hands. These were the men who had orchestrated the murder of millions. And they looked like clerks, like shopkeepers, like anyone you might pass on the street. That ordinariness is the most terrifying thing of all. It means that anyone can become a monster. It means that evil does not require fangs and horns. It only requires indifference, obedience, the willingness to follow orders." But the trials, for all their symbolic importance, did not provide the closure the women sought. Justice was too slow, too incomplete. Many of the guards from Ravensbrück escaped prosecution, disappearing into the chaos of post-war Europe. Some were tried and executed, but others lived out their lives in anonymity, their crimes unpunished. The diaries recorded this frustration, this sense that the world was moving on too quickly. that the lessons of the camps were already being forgotten. A Czech woman wrote bitterly about reading a newspaper article that referred to the camps as unfortunate episodes of the war. Unfortunate episodes, she wrote, as if we were unlucky, as if we had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not victims of deliberate, systematic extermination, not the targets of an ideology that declared us unworthy of life. Just unfortunate. I wanted to burn the newspaper. I wanted to scream, but I did neither. I wrote this instead. Because words are all I have. Words are my only weapon. The diaries also documented the emergence of survivor communities, networks of women who stayed in contact after leaving the camps, who supported each other through the difficult years of adjustment. They shared addresses, wrote letters, visited when they could. Some formed formal organizations dedicated to preserving the memory of the camps, to educating future generations, to fighting for recognition and reparations. The diaries became foundational texts for these organizations, primary sources that anchored their advocacy. A Belgian survivor who helped establish a memorial at Ravensbrück wrote about the importance of the diaries in her own notebook. "We are the last witnesses," she wrote. "When we are gone, these pages will speak for us. They will tell the world what happened here. They will ensure that the dead are not forgotten. This is our duty, our sacred obligation, and the Americans, by giving us the means to write, gave us the means to fulfill it." The recurring symbol in these diaries, the object that appeared again and again across hundreds of entries, was the pencil. Not the diary itself, though that was precious. Not the paper, though that was essential. But the pencil, that simple instrument of graphite and wood, became a talisman, a symbol of everything the camp had denied and everything freedom promised. The pencil represented agency, the ability to make a mark, to leave a trace. It represented voice, the power to speak one's truth without fear of retribution. It represented memory, the act of recording, of refusing to let the past dissolve into silence. And it represented hope, the belief that what one wrote might matter, might be read, might change something. The women wrote about the pencil in language that bordered on the mystical. A Hungarian prisoner described holding her pencil as if it were a piece of the divine, a fragment of the sacred. A Ukrainian woman wrote that the pencil was heavier than a weapon, sharper than a sword. These were not mere metaphors. In the camps, where pens and pencils were contraband, where the act of writing could result in death, the pencil had been a revolutionary tool. And now, in the aftermath, it remained revolutionary, not because it was forbidden, but because it was freely given. An acknowledgement of the writer's humanity, her right to speak, her worthiness to be heard. The Americans did not fully grasp the weight of what they had done. To them, distributing notebooks and pencils was a small gesture, a minor kindness in the face of overwhelming need. But to the women, it was an act of profound recognition. It said, "You are not just bodies to be fed and medicated. You are minds, souls, voices. You have stories, and those stories matter." This recognition was in many ways more nourishing than food, more healing than medicine. It restored something that the Nazis had tried to destroy: the sense of self, the belief in one's own value, the conviction that one's life, one's thoughts, one's experiences were significant. The pencil also symbolized a specifically American ethos, though the soldiers who handed them out might not have articulated it in these terms. America, for all its contradictions and failings, was a nation founded on the principle that the individual conscience is paramount, that the right to free expression is inalienable, that no government should have the power to dictate thought. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution enshrines this belief. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. This was a radical idea in the 18th century, and it remained radical in the 20th. Especially in contrast to totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, where speech was controlled, press was censored, and dissent was crushed. By giving the survivors the means to write freely, the Americans were, consciously or not, asserting this principle, this vision of freedom that begins in the mind and flows from the pen. The women intuited this. Many of them had been arrested for precisely this kind of freedom, for speaking against the regime, for writing pamphlets, for teaching forbidden ideas. They understood that the pencil was not neutral, that the act of writing was inherently political, and they embraced that politics, that defiance. They wrote not just to record but to resist, to declare that their voices could not be silenced, that their stories would endure, that the truth would outlast the lies. In this sense, the diaries were acts of war, battles fought not with guns but with words. Not for territory but for memory, not against soldiers but against oblivion. By the summer of 1945, most of the survivors had left Ravensbrück, dispersed to displaced persons camps, repatriation centers, or the few homes that still existed. The diaries went with them, tucked into suitcases, wrapped in cloth, guarded fiercely. Some women continued to write, adding new entries as they navigated the post-war world. Others stopped, unable to continue, the act of writing too closely tied to trauma. But the diaries endured, passed down through families, donated to archives, published as memoirs. They became, as the Belgian survivor had predicted, the voice of the dead, the testimony of those who did not survive to tell their own stories. The impact of these diaries extended far beyond their immediate authors. They influenced the development of survivor testimony as a genre, shaping how the Holocaust was remembered and narrated. They provided crucial evidence in war crimes trials, offering first-hand accounts that countered denial and revisionism. They educated generations of students who read them in classrooms and museums, learning not just about the Holocaust but about the power of the written word, the importance of bearing witness, the responsibility to remember. And they stood as a rebuke to totalitarianism in all its forms, a reminder that the human spirit, armed with nothing more than a pencil and paper, can resist even the most brutal attempts at domination. The American role in this story is complex. The United States did not prevent the Holocaust. It did not bomb the camps or prioritize the rescue of Jews. It closed its doors to refugees, turned away ships laden with desperate people, waited until military necessity aligned with moral obligation before acting. But in the aftermath, in the rubble and ashes, the Americans did something that mattered. They saw the survivors not as helpless victims, but as individuals with agency, with stories, with rights. They provided not just food and shelter, but the means to reclaim their voices. And in doing so, they participated in a different kind of liberation, one that went beyond the physical to the existential, the psychological, the spiritual. Lieutenant Helen Morrison, the nurse who had first distributed the notebooks, wrote in her own diary years later, after returning to the United States, that she often thought about the women of Ravensbrück. "I wonder," she wrote, "if they know what they gave me. I went there to help, to heal, to save lives, and I did those things, or tried to. But they saved me in a different way. They showed me what resilience looks like, what courage means, what it is to insist on your own humanity even when the world has denied it. I gave them pencils. They gave me a reason to believe in the power of the human spirit. I think I got the better end of that bargain." The women, for their part, never forgot. In reunions held decades later, in interviews conducted by historians, in letters exchanged across continents, they spoke about the diaries, about what it had meant to be allowed to write. A Polish survivor interviewed in the 1980s said, "The Nazis took everything from us, our families, our homes, our bodies, but they could not take our minds, not completely. And when the Americans gave us those notebooks, they gave us back the one thing the Nazis had tried hardest to destroy, the belief that our thoughts mattered, that our stories deserved to be told. That was the true liberation. Not the opening of the gates, but the opening of the page." The story of the diaries is not a simple tale of American benevolence or survivor gratitude.
It is a story about the intersection of power and vulnerability, about the ways in which freedom is both given and claimed, about the long shadow cast by atrocity. The women of Ravensbrück were not passive recipients of liberation. They were active participants in their own recovery, their own testimony, their own resistance. The diaries were their weapons, their shields, their monuments.
And the Americans, by providing the materials, by protecting the right to write, by recognizing the importance of individual voice, played a supporting role in a drama whose true protagonists were the women themselves. This recognition that the survivors were not just objects of pity, but subjects of their own stories, was a departure from how victims of atrocity had been treated in the past. Historically, the victims of war crimes and genocide had been silenced, their experiences reduced to statistics, their voices subsumed into official narratives. The Holocaust changed this, in part because of the diaries, the testimonies, the insistence of survivors that their stories be heard, and the American decision to facilitate this, to provide the tools and the freedom for survivors to speak. was a significant contribution to that shift, but it is also important to acknowledge what the diaries could not do. They could not bring back the dead. They could not erase the trauma. They could not undo the years of suffering or the loss of innocence. They could not make the world just or fair or safe. They were, in the end, just words on paper, fragile and imperfect, yet they endured, and in enduring, they testified to a truth that totalitarianism cannot abide, that the individual matters, that consciousness is sovereign, that memory is sacred, that words have power. The diaries also revealed the limits of language, the impossibility of fully capturing the horror of the camps. Many of the women wrote about this struggle, the sense that words were inadequate, that no description could convey the reality of what they had lived through. A Dutch survivor wrote, "I write and write and write, and still I feel that I am lying, not because I am dishonest, but because language itself is a lie." How do you describe the smell of burning flesh? How do you convey the sound of a woman begging for her child? How do you make someone understand what it feels like to watch a friend die and feel nothing? Because you have seen so much death that it no longer registers. I write these words and they sit on the page, neat and orderly, and they betray the chaos, the madness, the unbearable truth of what happened. Yet she wrote anyway. They all wrote anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence was complicity. Silence was what the Nazis wanted, what they had tried to impose through terror and extermination. To write was to refuse that silence, to declare that the dead would not be forgotten, that the truth would not be buried. It was a small act in the grand scheme of things, but it was not an insignificant one. In the decades that followed, the diaries took on new meanings, new purposes. They were cited in history books, quoted in documentaries, studied by scholars. They became artifacts, preserved in climate-controlled archives, handled with gloves, scanned into digital databases. They were no longer just personal records, but public property, part of the collective memory of the Holocaust. This transition was not without tension. Some survivors were uncomfortable with the exposure, with having their private thoughts dissected by strangers, analyzed by academics, turned into lessons for school children. But most accepted it, understanding that their diaries had a purpose beyond their own lives, that they were part of a larger project of memory and education. The diaries also became points of connection between survivors and subsequent generations. Grandchildren read the diaries of grandmothers they had never met, learning about the women their ancestors had been before and after the camps. Students read them in classrooms, grappling with questions of morality, responsibility, and resistance. Researchers read them to understand the mechanics of survival, the psychology of trauma, the social dynamics of the camps, and in each reading, the diaries lived again, speaking across time, bridging the gap between past and present. There is a particular entry written by a Czech woman named Vera Fultinova that has become emblematic of the Diary Project. Vera was a political prisoner, a socialist arrested for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. She spent 4 years in Ravensbrück, working in the camp's textile factory, and she kept a mental diary, memorizing entries because she had no access to paper. After liberation, when she was given a notebook by an American medic, she spent 3 days writing down everything she had memorized, a flood of words that filled the entire notebook. Her handwriting was frantic, almost illegible, as if she feared that if she paused, the memories would slip away. In the final entry of that first notebook, she wrote, "I do not know who will read this. Perhaps no one. Perhaps everyone. It does not matter. What matters is that I wrote it. What matters is that I had the freedom to write it. The Nazis took many things from me, my youth, my health, my faith in humanity. But they did not take my mind. They did not take my voice. And now, with this pencil, I reclaim both. This diary is my declaration of independence. It is my resistance, it is my revenge, and it is my gift to the future. Proof that I was here, that I mattered, that I survived." That entry, with its fierce assertion of selfhood, its refusal to be erased, encapsulates the spirit of the diaries, the reason they matter. The women of Ravensbrück were shaken when the Americans allowed them to keep diaries, not because the gesture was grand or dramatic, but because it was simple and profound. It acknowledged their humanity at a moment when they had been told for years that they had none. It gave them a tool to resist, to remember, to endure, and it created a legacy that extends far beyond the camps, far beyond the war, far beyond the individuals who wrote those first tentative words on those fragile pages. The pencil, the paper, the diary, these were not merely objects. They were symbols of a larger truth, a truth that the Nazis had denied and the Americans affirmed, that freedom begins in the mind, that the right to speak, to write, to think is the foundation of all other rights, that the individual, with her singular story, her unique voice, her irreplaceable perspective, is the ultimate bulwark against tyranny. The Diaries of Ravensbrück stand as testament to this truth. Monuments built not of stone but of words, enduring not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. Powerful not because they shout, but because they whisper insistently, urgently across the years. Remember, bear witness, do not forget, and in remembering, in bearing witness, in refusing to forget, we honor not just the women who wrote those diaries, but the principle for which they wrote, that every life matters, every story deserves to be told, every voice has the right to be heard. This is the legacy of those fragile notebooks, those blunt pencils, those women who were shaken to discover that, against all expectation, their words still mattered. It is a legacy that belongs not to one nation or one people, but to all humanity, a reminder that in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, the simple act of writing can be an act of defiance, an assertion of hope, a declaration that the human spirit, however battered and broken, endures.